They don't know what changed, they just know they lost control of the bond. That's how it starts. Not with a fight, not with a goodbye, and definitely not with a dramatic declaration of growth. The shift happens quietly, almost invisibly, and yet the avoidant feels it immediately. There's a subtle disorientation that sets in, a sense that something familiar is no longer responding the way it used to. You didn't announce that you were evolving, you didn't threaten to leave or demand more. You simply stopped orbiting their emotional comfort zone, and that alone rewired the dynamic. Before, the bond moved around their needs, their pace, their fears. When they pulled away, you adjusted. When they went silent, you waited. That predictability gave them a sense of control, even if they never consciously claimed it. But growth changes the gravitational center of a connection. And the moment you stopped organizing your emotions around their availability, the bond lost its old shape. They didn't feel anger first. They felt uncertainty. And uncertainty is deeply unsettling for an avoidant. Avoidants don't register growth through conversations or explanations. They feel it through the absence of pressure, through the lack of pursuit, through the sudden quiet where emotional labor used to live. You didn't stop caring, you stopped compensating, and that's the part they can't name. Because from the outside, nothing dramatic happened, but internally the bond stopped regulating them. Their distance no longer created relief, their silence no longer produced control, and that's when the shift becomes undeniable. This is the first signal that you've outgrown them. Their usual strategies stop working, not because you're punishing them, but because you're no longer playing the role that kept the system stable. You're not chasing reassurance. You're not bending yourself to keep the connection alive. You're present, but no longer centered on them, and that creates a quiet loss of power. They can feel, but can't confront. What unsettles an avoidant most isn't being left. It's being left emotionally without a rupture. No argument to detach from. No dramatic ending to justify withdrawal. Just the slow realization that access has changed, that you're no longer emotionally reachable in the same way. And because avoidants rely on distance to feel safe, when distance stops creating leverage, it turns into something else entirely: fear of irrelevance. They may not react right away. In fact, they often appear calmer at first. But underneath that calm is a growing awareness that the bond no longer revolves around them, that you've stepped out of the familiar pattern without asking permission. And that's when they begin to feel it. Not as loss yet, but as destabilization. The moment they realize the connection no longer moves when they pull is the moment they understand on a nervous system level that you've already shifted beyond them. An avoidant can handle your pain. What they can't handle is your peace. Anger, tears, frustration, those emotions never scared them the way your calm does now. When you were emotional, the rules of the connection were clear. You reacted, they retreated, you expressed, they withdrew. That dynamic gave them something familiar to lean on. Your pain signaled attachment. It told them they still mattered, still had influence, still held the emotional center of gravity. Even if it felt chaotic to you, it felt predictable to them. But calm changes everything. Calm doesn't chase. Calm doesn't explain itself. Calm doesn't negotiate closeness or ask for reassurance. And for an avoidant, that's profoundly disturbing because calm isn't a reaction. It's a boundary they didn't set and can't control. When you stop responding from hurt, you quietly exit the emotional tug of war. And without that push and pull, their usual strategy collapses. Before, withdrawal worked, distance created relief, silence restored balance. If things got too intense, they could step back and regain power simply by doing less. But your calm removes that lever. There's nothing to pull away from when you're no longer leaning in. No emotional surge to escape, no urgency to regulate, and that absence doesn't soothe them. It destabilizes them. This is where their nervous system gets confused. Avoidants are wired to interpret intensity as danger and distance as safety. Your anger fit that system. Your sadness fit that system. Even your pleas for clarity fit that system. But peace doesn't. Peace signals self-containment. It suggests you found emotional stability outside of them. And once that possibility enters the bond, the avoidance sense of control begins to erode. Your calm tells them something terrifying without ever saying it out loud. I don't need this dynamic to feel okay anymore. And that message lands far deeper than any confrontation ever could. It dismantles the unspoken agreement where they regulated closeness by pulling away, and you responded by reaching forward. Now there's nothing to regulate your steady, whether they come closer or not. This is why they may start to test you. Subtle messages, delayed replies, small withdrawals meant to provoke a reaction, not because they want drama, but because they're checking if the old system still exists. They're looking for proof that your calm is temporary, that underneath it, you're still emotionally tethered in the same way. But when your peace remains, the truth becomes unavoidable. Calm doesn't threaten an avoidant with loss, it threatens them with irrelevance, with the realization that the bond no longer revolves around their fear. And that's why your peace is more unsettling than your pain ever was. Because pain kept you connected to the system, peace quietly releases you from it. And the moment they sense that release, they feel the shift again, deeper this time, realizing that the connection no longer depends on their distance to survive. The day their silence stops hurting you is the day it starts haunting them. For a long time, their distance had weight. Silence created anxiety. Space triggered questions. Every pause felt loaded with meaning because you were emotionally invested in the response it might provoke. And the avoidant learned, often unconsciously, that distance worked. It regulated them. When closeness felt overwhelming, they pulled back. When emotions rose, they went quiet. And your reaction completed the cycle. Your worry, your confusion, your reaching out reassured them that the bond was still intact, still centered on them. But something changes when distance no longer wounds you. Not because you've grown cold, but because you've grown steady. Their silence stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like information. You don't chase it. You don't fill the gaps. You don't personalize it. And the moment your nervous system stops reacting, there starts to avoidance rely on distance the way others rely on reassurance. It's how they regulate discomfort, maintain autonomy, and avoid emotional overwhelm. Distance isn't rejection to them, it's relief. But that relief depends on one thing, that someone is still waiting on the other side of the silence. When you stop waiting, the function of distance collapses. What once calmed them now turns inward, activating the very discomfort they were trying to avoid. At first, they may not even notice consciously, there's just a faint unease, a subtle sense that their absence didn't land the way it used to, no follow-up message, no emotional check-in, no tension to return to, and without realizing it, they begin to feel something unfamiliar. Unmirrored distance, silence without impact, space that doesn't pull you back in. This is why they don't miss you right away. Missing you would require emotional vulnerability. They're not ready to access. Instead, they miss the version of you that reacted, the one who filled the quiet with meaning, the one who made their withdrawal feel powerful, because that version of you made their internal world predictable. Your reactions gave structure to their avoidance. When that version disappears, the bond becomes destabilizing. They start replaying interactions, not out of longing, but out of confusion. Why didn't that silence work? Why didn't you reach? Why does the distance feel different now? These questions don't bring them closer, they unsettle them. And unsettlement is dangerous territory for an avoidant. Your lack of reaction removes the emotional echo they depended on. And without that echo, their silence becomes louder to them than it ever was to you. It forces them to sit with themselves instead of escaping into space. And that's when silence becomes haunting, not because you're gone, but because the strategy no longer protects them. This is the quiet power of growth. You didn't confront their distance. You outgrew it. And when distance stops working on you, it stops working for them. That's the moment the dynamic turns not outward, but inward, where they begin to feel the weight of the space they created without you rushing in to soften it. They didn't lose you. They lost their position in your life. That distinction matters because what they feel isn't absence at first, it's displacement. You're still there. You're still kind. You're still grounded, but you're no longer orienting yourself around them. And that subtle shift creates an invisible imbalance they can't explain, only sense. Outgrowing an avoidant doesn't look like dominance or superiority. It looks like forward motion. And that's what makes them suddenly feel behind. You didn't move faster to outpace them. You simply stopped slowing yourself down to match their emotional limitations. While you were learning to regulate your emotions, expand your awareness, and detach without shutting down, they were still protecting the same old wounds, still avoiding the same discomfort, still using distance as armor. And when growth happens asymmetrically, the gap becomes undeniable, not in words but in presence. Avoidants are highly sensitive to hierarchy in connection, even if they'd never frame it that way. When the bond revolved around their fears, they felt stable. When your emotional state responded to their availability, they felt anchored. But growth removes that. You no longer look to them for regulation or reassurance. You're not seeking permission to feel okay. And that quietly removes them from the emotional center of your life. This is when they begin to feel small, not because you diminish them, but because the dynamic no longer inflates them. You're no longer reacting, proving, or adjusting to keep the bond intact. You've stepped into a self-contained emotional posture, and that changes how they experience themselves around you. Suddenly, they're aware of what hasn't changed inside them, the fears they've been managing instead of healing, the intimacy they've been postponing instead of learning. What's unsettling is that you didn't leave them behind with a decision. You outgrew them without confrontation, and that kind of growth creates a mirror they didn't ask to look into. Standing next to you now feels different. Not because you're colder, but because you're fuller, more rooted, less reactive. And that contrast is impossible to ignore. This is why they may start acting younger around you, more defensive, more avoidant, or oddly quiet. Not because you're intimidating, but because the emotional roles have shifted. They're no longer the one with the upper hand. They're no longer the one setting the pace. And without that familiar position, they feel exposed. They didn't lose you. You didn't disappear. What they lost was access to the version of you that centered them, the one who waited, the one who paused their growth to preserve the bond. And once that version is gone, the imbalance becomes permanent. Because growth doesn't reverse, it reveals, and in that revelation, they don't feel rejected. They feel left behind by their own unwillingness to move forward. They feel the shift because you stopped chasing clarity. And for a long time, clarity felt like the goal. Understanding, labels, conversations that promised relief if you could just say the right thing or ask the right question. And the avoidant learned that withholding clarity gave them space. If things got uncomfortable, they could delay, deflect, or stay vague, and the bond would pause until you reached again. Your need to understand kept the connection alive on their terms. But the moment you stop chasing clarity, the entire power structure changes. Not because you suddenly understand everything, but because you no longer require answers to stay grounded. You don't ask for reassurance to calm yourself. You don't press for explanations to feel secure. And most importantly, you stop trying to be understood by someone who was never able to hold your emotional truth without retreating. This is the power shift they never talk about, because it doesn't come from confrontation. It doesn't come from ultimatums or emotional withdrawal. It comes from internal resolution. You realize that clarity from an avoidant often arrives late, filtered, or incomplete, and that waiting for it kept you emotionally tethered. When you release that need, you step out of the cycle without making a scene. Avoidants rely on distance not just to feel safe, but to retain leverage. Space allowed them to regulate the connection. Silence gave them control over pacing. Ambiguity protected them from accountability. But all of that only works when the other person is still leaning in. When you stop leaning, distance loses its function. There's nothing to manage if you're already steady. Your lack of pursuit creates an unsettling vacuum. They may sense it in the way conversations shorten, in how you no longer circle back to unresolved topics, in the absence of emotional follow-ups. You're still present, but not probing, still open, but not searching. And that distinction is deeply unsettling to an avoidant because it signals emotional autonomy they didn't authorize. This is where fear sets in. Not the fear of losing you outright, but the fear of losing influence, of no longer being the one who decides when closeness happens, when explanations are given, or when emotional labor resumes. You're no longer waiting at the edge of their readiness. You've moved forward without dragging them along. They may respond by offering delayed clarity, sudden vulnerability, half answers wrapped in sentiment, not because they've changed, but because they feel the shift they sense that distance no longer secures the bond. And without leverage, they're exposed to something they've spent a lifetime avoiding: mutuality. You didn't take power from them, you reclaimed it by no longer needing what they withheld. And that's what terrifies an avoidant most. Not anger, not boundaries, but the quiet realization that the connection no longer depends on their willingness to explain themselves. When clarity stops being chased, the bond stops being controlled, and that's the moment they feel the shift deeply, silently, and without a word being spoken. When an avoidant goes silent but still watches growth has been detected. This is the phase most people misunderstand. From the outside, it looks like nothing is happening, no messages, no reach outs, no obvious signs of longing. But internally, something has shifted. The silence isn't empty anymore, it's observant. They're not disengaged, they're monitoring, because outgrowing an avoidant doesn't trigger immediate pursuit. It triggers surveillance. Avoidants don't reach out when they're unsure of emotional safety. They observe first. They scan for signs that the old dynamic still exists, that you're still available, still reactive, still emotionally positioned in the same place. And when they sense that you're not, curiosity quietly replaces certainty. Not enough to act, but enough to watch. They won't admit this curiosity, even to themselves. Curiosity implies desire. Desire implies vulnerability. And vulnerability threatens the protective distance they've built their identity around. So instead of reaching out, they stay silent and gather information. Who are you now? Are you still emotionally open? Are you moving on? Are you okay without them? Internally, a quiet question starts looping. Did I lose access or just attention? Because attention can be regained, access can't. Attention is about visibility. Access is about emotional availability, and avoidants are acutely sensitive to the difference. They're trying to determine whether the door is still open or if it closed without noise. Outgrowing them makes you unpredictable, and unpredictability is deeply destabilizing to avoidance. The old pattern relied on knowing your reactions, knowing that silence would produce anxiety, knowing that distance would eventually pull you closer. But growth interrupts that script. You no longer behave in ways they can anticipate or control. And without predictability, their nervous system can't relax. This is why they watch from a distance, not to reconnect, but to orient themselves, to see if the bond still operates under familiar rules. Every post, every update, every sign of emotional steadiness becomes data. Are you thriving? Are you indifferent? Are you still reachable? And the more self-contained you appear, the more unsettled they become. What they don't realize is that watching keeps them emotionally engaged without requiring vulnerability. It's a way to stay connected while telling themselves they're detached. But the longer they watch without acting, the clearer the truth becomes. The connection has shifted beyond passive observation. Silence used to be their shield. Now it's their window. And through that window, they're forced to witness something they didn't expect: you living without orbiting them. That realization doesn't push them forward immediately. It freezes them, because moving toward you would require risking intimacy, and moving away would require accepting loss. So they stay quiet. They keep watching. And in that stillness, avoidance begins to crack, not because you confronted them, but because you became unreadable. And for an avoidant, unreadable isn't mysterious, it's threatening, because it means the bond no longer exists on terms they understand. The moment you stop proving yourself, the bond rewrites itself. And for a long time, worth felt like something you had to demonstrate through patience, through understanding, through staying when things were unclear. You showed love by accommodating their distance, by minimizing your needs, by becoming easier to be with so they wouldn't feel pressured. And without realizing it, the connection turned into an unspoken audition, one where you were constantly proving that you were safe, flexible, and low demand enough to be chosen. Avoidants attach most comfortably when autonomy is protected and expectations feel minimal. They don't lean into bonds that require emotional performance from them. They lean into bonds where the other person carries more of the emotional weight. And when you were trying to prove your worth, you were doing exactly that. You were overfunctioning to keep the bond alive. You were translating silence, softening disappointment, and convincing yourself that consistency would eventually be rewarded. But the moment you stop auditioning for love, something profound happens. You don't become cold. You don't become distant. You become self-contained. You no longer bend to be acceptable. You no longer present your value for evaluation. You simply exist in it. And that changes how the bond functions at a structural level. This is where the rewrite begins. Because emotional unavailability doesn't always look like avoidance, sometimes it looks like self-respect. It looks like not over explaining, not over giving, not proving your emotional lineal to someone who never matched it. And for an avoidant, this kind of availability is unfamiliar and unsettling. They've mastered distance, they've mastered detachment, but they've never mastered being grounded and open without self-abandonment. So when you stop proving yourself, you step into a form of emotional autonomy they don't recognize. You're still warm, still present, but no longer accessible in the way that fed the dynamic. And that's when they feel the loss. Not as heartbreak, not as panic, but as something quieter and deeper. A subtle awareness that the bond no longer reinforces their comfort. That your presence no longer revolves around earning closeness. That the emotional supply they unconsciously relied on has dried up, not because you withdrew it, but because you no longer needed to give it. They may not react outwardly, avoidants rarely do, but internally there's a shift. They begin to sense that the connection no longer bends toward them, that you're no longer invested in being chosen, only in being aligned. And alignment doesn't beg, it doesn't chase, it doesn't audition. This is the loss they feel without being able to name it, the loss of influence, the loss of emotional certainty, the loss of the version of you that was always available for interpretation, accommodation, and patience. When you stop proving your worth, you don't threaten the bond, you outgrow it, and that growth quietly, permanently rewrites the rules of connection in a way they never learned how to follow. They feel you leaving, but there was no goodbye. That's what unsettles them most. Not that you disappeared, but that nothing exploded on the way out. No final argument, no dramatic boundary, no emotional rupture they could point to and say, this is why I pulled away. Outgrowing them didn't look like confrontation. It looked like emotional completion. And for an avoidant, that's the hardest ending to process because there's nothing to detach from. Avoidants are built to disconnect through conflict. Tension gives them justification. Anger gives them distance. Even pain gives them a story they can retreat behind. But when you leave quietly, still respectful, still calm, still whole, there's no emotional debris to hide behind. The bond doesn't shatter, it simply dissolves. And that creates a unique kind of discomfort they don't know how to resolve. You didn't demand closure. You didn't wait for clarity. You didn't need one last conversation to validate your experience. You reached a place internally where the story finished on its own. And when that happens, the avoidant feels you slipping away without any signal they were trained to recognize. No warning, no resistance, just absence of attachment. And that absence is disorienting. This is why they replay the connection in their mind, not to reconnect, but to locate the ending. Where did it end? What moment marked the loss? But there isn't one, because emotional completion doesn't announce itself. It simply removes the charge. And without charge, avoidance has nothing to push against. That's when the second conflict begins. The one they can't name. They're not scared of losing you. They're scared of wanting you again. Your growth reactivates something dangerous inside them. Desire. Not the needy kind, the quiet, inconvenient kind. The kind that surfaces when the other person no longer asks for anything. Your self-containment makes you feel safer and more distant at the same time. And that combination triggers both longing and fear in equal measure. Desire pulls them toward you. Fear slams the brakes. Wanting you again would mean risking closeness without the old power dynamics. It would mean stepping toward someone who no longer waits, no longer proves, no longer chases. And that's terrifying to an avoidant whose safety has always lived in control. This creates paralysis. They don't reach out because desire feels dangerous. They don't move on because the bond isn't unresolved through conflict. They're stuck between attraction and self-protection with no familiar exit strategy. So they do nothing and feel everything. From the outside, it looks like indifference, silence, distance. But internally, it's noisy, confusing, heavy, because your growth didn't just end a connection, it exposed what they avoided feeling all along. And without conflict to detach from, and without control to lean on, they're left alone with the one thing they fear most: genuine desire they can't regulate. That's the quiet consequence of outgrowing an avoidant. You don't force an ending, you complete it. And in doing so, you leave them suspended in a feeling they never learned how to move through, wanting you without the safety of distance to escape it. They feel it because growth removes the invitation. This is the quiet, invisible truth that avoids never admit. They don't sense anger, blame, or resentment. They sense autonomy. You didn't harden. You didn't shut down. You didn't build walls or punish them for their distance. You simply stopped waiting. You stopped orbiting the pattern they had learned to control. And in that stillness, in that quiet self-containment, the bond shifts in ways they can feel but can't articulate. They begin to notice the absence of need, the absence of emotional chasing, and the absence of dependence. And that absence terrifies them because avoidance isn't about disinterest. It's about control. They've built systems where they can regulate closeness by manipulating availability. But when you outgrow the need for their validation, their leverage disappears. The dance, pursuit, and retreat no longer exists. And in that disappearance, they feel something unfamiliar, irrelevant. What's remarkable is that you didn't leave. You didn't make a show of your independence. You didn't announce that the connection was over. You didn't close a door. You simply expanded, evolved, and aligned yourself with a level of emotional completeness they never accounted for. And that's why avoidants experience panic and longing simultaneously, not because you rejected them, but because the bond no longer revolves around them. They may replay memories, check in silently, or test boundaries subtly, but internally, they know that the system they relied on to maintain closeness has shifted. Your growth isn't loud, it doesn't demand attention, but it removes the subtle invitation they once held power over, the invitation to define how love, care, and attention flowed between you. And without that invitation, they are left facing the truth they can't name. You are no longer dependent on their participation for your emotional stability. And here's the paradox that shakes them the most. They didn't lose you. They didn't miss out because you left. They missed out because you outgrew them. You grew beyond the emotional orbit they could contain. You stopped bending, stopped adjusting, and stopped proving your worth. And in doing so, you created a bond they can no longer regulate, a bond where your presence no longer implies permission for them to control it. This realization hits differently than any fight, argument, or confrontation ever could. Avoidants don't need you to disappear to feel lost. They need to feel the absence of their power over you. And your growth does exactly that. It removes the system that sustained the dance of pursuit and retreat, leaving them suspended in a mix of longing, confusion, and quiet awareness. Ultimately, the final truth is simple and devastating in its clarity. They feel it because growth removes the invitation. And in that removal, they understand, not through your absence, not through your anger, not through punishment, that the bond has shifted irreversibly. You didn't leave them, you outgrew them. And that alone changes everything.